The gun came up fast, and Clark Calloway stepped directly into the path between the stranger and the door of the Keller boarding house, his hand resting easy on the pearl handle of his Colt revolver, his eyes carrying none of the ease his posture pretended to suggest. "I am going to need you to turn around and walk back to whatever hole you crawled out of," Clark said, his voice low enough that only the two of them could hear it above the wind cutting down the main street of Redstone, Texas, in the autumn of 1879. The stranger, a lean and angular man with hollow cheeks and a scar running from the corner of his mouth to his jaw, tilted his head and smiled the kind of smile that had no warmth anywhere inside it. He was holding a folded piece of paper between two fingers, and he waggled it slightly, as if Clark might be tempted to reach for it. "I just want to speak with her," the stranger said. "Just a conversation, nothing more than that." Clark did not move. He had not moved since he had come around the corner of the feed store and seen this man standing at the bottom of the porch steps, staring up at the frosted glass of the boarding house door with an expression that Clark recognized from a very particular kind of man. The kind of man who believed that wanting something was the same as being entitled to have it. "She does not know your name," Clark said, his jaw set hard, his eyes never leaving the stranger's face, "and she is not going to." The stranger's smile faded by a fraction. His eyes moved sideways, calculating, and Clark felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise because that sideways glance was not the look of a man who was about to leave. That was the look of a man who was counting his options, looking for angles, measuring the distance between himself and a consequence. "You have no idea who I am," the stranger said, and there was something coiled inside those words, something dangerous and cold. "I do not need to," Clark answered. "What I know is that you are standing in front of a door that you have no business being in front of, and in about 10 seconds I am going to stop being polite about asking you to leave." The wind pushed a cloud of red dust between them, and for a long moment the whole street seemed to hold its breath. Then the stranger folded the paper, tucked it back into his coat pocket, and took a single step backward. His eyes did not leave Clark's face. "You cannot protect her forever, Calloway," he said, and the fact that he knew Clark's name made something cold settle at the base of Clark's spine. "I can protect her today," Clark said. "Now get moving." The stranger turned, walked to his horse tied at the post outside the saloon, mounted without hurry, and rode south without looking back. Clark stood watching until the dust settled behind him, and even then he did not fully relax. He turned toward the boarding house, looked up at the second-floor window where the curtain had moved, and felt the complicated weight of everything that had led him to this moment settle back over his shoulders like a coat that had gotten very heavy over the past 6 months. 6 months earlier, Clark Calloway had not been a man who stood on porches protecting anyone. He had been a man passing through. That was the precise and honest description of himself that Clark had carried for the better part of 4 years, ever since the end of a bad situation in Abilene that had cost him his reputation, his savings, and the better part of his faith in people who made promises. He had drifted west and then south, taking work where he could find it, which usually meant his gun and his willingness to use it if necessary, though he preferred not to. He was 28 years old, lean and brown from the sun, with dark hair that needed cutting and green eyes that people sometimes found unsettling because they tended to see more than Clark let on that he was seeing. Redstone was supposed to be another stop, a week, maybe 2. He had come in on a stage from San Angelo in April, when the bluebonnets were just beginning to come up along the creek beds, and the air still had a morning chill sharp enough to make the coffee worth drinking. He had taken a room at Keller's boarding house because it was the only establishment in Redstone that was not either a saloon or a livery stable, and he had intended to stay only until he had rested his legs and figured out which direction had something worth riding toward. Beatrice Keller had opened the door. He remembered it with a clarity that surprised him every time he returned to it, because Clark Calloway was not a man who committed much to memory. He traveled light in every sense of the word. But the memory of that first morning, standing on the porch with his saddlebags over one shoulder and the stage already rolling away behind him, and the door swinging open to reveal Beatrice Keller. That memory had apparently decided to make itself permanent without asking his permission. She was 24 years old, with dark brown hair that she kept pinned up in practical coils, and brown eyes that were warm without being soft, the way good firelight is warm without being careless. She was not small, but she carried herself efficiently, like a woman who had learned early that the world did not offer extra space, and you had to claim what you needed. She had flour on the sleeve of her dress from baking, and she looked at him with the frank, assessing gaze of someone who had rented rooms to enough strangers to have developed reliable instincts. "Room is $2 a week," she said before he could say anything at all. "That includes breakfast and supper. Lunch is your own affair. No gambling in the rooms, no visitors after 9 in the evening, and if you come in drunk I will charge you double for the inconvenience." "Those are clear terms," Clark said. "I find clear terms save everyone a great deal of trouble," she said, and stepped back to let him in. He had intended to stay 1 week. He had been in Redstone for 6 months. Beatrice Keller ran the boarding house alone, which Clark had understood on the first day but had taken longer to fully appreciate. Her father, Thomas Keller, had built the house in 1871, when Redstone was just beginning to grow into something more than a cattle stop. He had been a carpenter from Ohio who had followed the possibility of land and open air westward, and he had been good at what he did. The house was solid and well made, with good windows and a staircase that did not creak more than 1 step, which Clark had catalogued out of old habit on his first night. Thomas Keller had died of pneumonia in the winter of 1876, leaving Beatrice the house, a small amount of savings, and the considerable weight of a mortgage payment due to the Redstone Merchant Bank every 3 months. Her mother had died years before, back in Ohio, when Beatrice was 11. She had no siblings. She had the house in her own 2 capable hands, and she had built something functional and dignified out of what could have easily become a catastrophe. Clark learned all of this not from Beatrice, who did not volunteer personal information, but from Mrs. Dunbar at the dry goods store, who was the kind of woman who treated information like a currency and spent it freely. He had gone in for tobacco and come out knowing rather more about Redstone's social landscape than he had asked for, but some of it he filed away because it seemed relevant. What he learned from Beatrice herself, over breakfast tables and across the narrow hall of her well-run house, was different and quieter and more interesting than anything Mrs. Dunbar had to offer. He learned that she read. She had 3 shelves of books in the sitting room, and she was working through them in a rotation that suggested she had read most of them before and was finding different things in them on the second pass. When he asked her about it, because the books were visible from the breakfast table and he was curious, she had looked at him with a mild surprise that people seemed to feel when they realized Clark was paying attention. "My father always said that a person who stops learning has stopped living," she said. "I took that seriously. What are you reading now?" She had told him, and it had turned into a conversation that lasted long enough for Clark to realize that his coffee had gone cold without his noticing, which was so unusual for him that it registered as a kind of event. He learned that she was not without humor, though it was dry and quiet, and came out sideways when you were not expecting it. He learned that she had strong opinions about the territorial government's land policies that she would share with some force if given a reasonable opening. He learned that she was kind to the Hernandez family who lived at the south edge of town, and to old James Whitfield who had no money and sometimes needed a meal, and that her kindness was practical rather than performative, offered without ceremony or expectation of acknowledgement. He also learned, with a slowness that he attributed to long practice at not seeing things he was not looking for, that she was lonely. Not the desperate kind of lonely. Beatrice Keller was too self-sufficient for desperation. But there was a particular quality to the way she sometimes looked out the window in the evenings, toward the street where couples walked and children were called home, that told Clark things she would never have said aloud. She had built a life that was whole and functional and entirely constructed around solitude, and she had done it so well that she had perhaps forgotten what it felt like to build anything together with someone. Clark recognized it because he had built the same kind of life, just with wheels under it. The trouble was, he was not a man who stayed. He knew that about himself with the certainty of long evidence. He had tried staying once, in Abilene, with a woman named Helen who had deserved far better than a man whose past kept arriving uninvited. That had ended with broken trust and a damaged reputation, and Clark had made himself a firm promise afterward about the wisdom of setting down roots when you were not sure the ground was sound. But he kept finding reasons to stay in Redstone. The first reason was legitimate. A job offer from the county sheriff, a quiet and decent man named Harland Oates, who was getting on in years and needed a capable deputy. Clark took the job on a provisional basis, telling himself it was just until Oates could find someone more permanent. That had been in May. The second reason was the one he did not admit to himself for longer than was probably honest. He had been watching Beatrice for 3 months before he acknowledged that watching her had become something specific and directional, something that had a name he was avoiding. He watched the way she managed her house with quiet competence, the way she negotiated fairly with the suppliers who came to her door, the way she handled difficult boarders with a combination of firm courtesy and an absolute refusal to be bullied. He watched the way she laughed when something genuinely struck her as funny, a real laugh from the middle of her, not the polite kind. He watched the way she moved through her own kitchen at 5 in the morning when she thought no one was up yet, with a kind of ease that was different from her public manner, looser and softer, and he had made himself stop watching that because it felt too much like something that needed to be earned. The first conversation that was truly something more than polite exchange had happened in July. On a hot evening when the rest of the boarders had gone to the church, Social and Beatrice had stayed behind to fix a hinge on the back door that had been giving her trouble. Clark had stayed because he did not have the easy sociability that church socials required, and he had found her in the back, struggling with a screwdriver that was slightly too large for the screws she was working with. He had offered to help. She had been about to decline in the politely firm way she declined most offers, and then she had looked at the hinge and at the screwdriver and made a pragmatic decision. "The smaller one is in the toolbox on the shelf," she said. "If you would bring it, I would appreciate it." He had brought it, and then he had held the door steady while she worked, because the hinges on old Texas doors tended to pull away from the frame if you were not careful, and when it was done, they had both sat on the back step because the evening air was finally cooling, and neither of them was in a particular hurry to go inside. "You have stayed longer than most," she said, not looking at him, looking out at the dry yard where a single mesquite tree was doing its best. "I have a job here," he said. "You had a job in other places too, I expect." He thought about that. "Yes." "What is different about Redstone?" It was a direct question from a direct woman, and he found that he could not give her anything less than a direct answer. "I am not entirely sure yet," he said. "I am still figuring that out." She had looked at him then, just briefly, with an expression that was careful and a little guarded, the way people look when they want to hope something but are protecting themselves against the cost of being wrong about it. "Well," she said, getting up and brushing the dust from her skirt, "let me know when you figure it out." It was the invitation and the warning in one sentence, and Clark had thought about it for the better part of 2 weeks. By August, Sheriff Oates had offered him the deputy position permanently, with a modest but reliable salary and a small office in the new courthouse that was being finished at the north end of the main street. Clark accepted it and wrote his name on the paper and felt, for the first time in a long while, that he had done something with weight to it. He had told Beatrice over breakfast, and she had said, "That is good news for Redstone," and refilled his coffee, and the warmth in her voice when she said it had been a very specific kind of warmth that Clark had catalogued, and then spent the next several days pretending he had not. The thing that complicated everything was the thing Clark had not told anyone in Redstone about. His dark past was not spectacular in the way of outlaws and wanted posters, but it was complicated and heavy, and it had a habit of following him. In Abilene, he had worked for a cattle broker named Silas Croft, who had turned out to be running stolen stock through a network that stretched from Kansas to New Mexico territory. Clark had not known about it when he took the work, but by the time he understood what he had been participating in, he had been deep enough inside the operation that getting out cleanly had required choices that did not look clean from the outside. He had testified against Croft in a federal proceeding. That testimony had put Croft's brother Marcus in prison along with Silas, and Marcus Croft was the kind of man who did not forget that kind of thing. The stranger who had appeared outside Beatrice's door on that October morning was a man named Voss, and Clark knew him as Marcus Croft's primary instrument. He was not an assassin exactly, but he was a finder, a man who located people that Marcus Croft wanted found for purposes that were never good. The fact that Voss was in Redstone meant that Marcus Croft had found Clark. The fact that Voss had gone to the boarding house first, rather than to the courthouse, told Clark something specific and deeply unsettling about what Marcus Croft thought he knew. He knew about Beatrice. Clark went to the sheriff's office after watching Voss ride south, and he sat down across from Harland Oates and told him the full truth about Abilene. He owed Oates that. He had been keeping the secret out of a misguided instinct to handle it alone, which was an old bad habit, but Voss's presence had made it too large to contain privately. Oates listened without interrupting, which was characteristic of him, and when Clark finished, the old sheriff leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. "Marcus Croft got out of federal prison 14 months ago," Oates said. Clark had not known that. The news settled in his chest like a stone. "I have heard of him," Oates continued. "He operated out of Fort Worth before Abilene. He is not a careful man, Clark, but he is a persistent one." "I know," Clark said. "I had hoped 4 years was enough distance. What does he want?" "He wants me uncomfortable and afraid first," Clark said. "Eventually he wants me gone, either way." Oates was quiet for another moment. "And why did Voss go to the Keller house first?" Clark did not answer immediately because the answer required admitting something that he had been carrying quietly for several months. "Because someone has been watching me," he finally said. "Someone noticed where I spend my time when I am not working, and reported that back." The implication hung in the air between them. Oates pulled at his gray mustache, his eyes steady and grave. "You need to tell her," Oates said. "I know," Clark said. It was the sentence he had been dreading most. Not because he was afraid of Beatrice's reaction, exactly, though he knew it would not be simple, but because telling her meant laying out all of the things he had not said, and doing it in a moment that was driven by danger rather than by choice, and that felt like the worst possible version of a conversation he had been meaning to have differently. He went to the boarding house in the late afternoon, when the other boarders were at supper and Beatrice was in the kitchen cleaning up after serving them. He knocked on the kitchen doorframe because Beatrice had firm boundaries about the kitchen and he respected them. "I need to speak with you," he said, "when you have a moment." She looked at him over her shoulder, read something in his expression, and dried her hands on her apron with a care that told him she was already preparing herself. "Sit down," she said. "I will put coffee on." He sat at the kitchen table, which was a more intimate setting than the dining room and felt like it, and he waited while she moved around the familiar space with her characteristic efficiency, and he thought about all the mornings he had sat at that table and wished he were someone without a complicated past, someone who could simply ask a plain question and receive a plain answer. She set 2 cups down, sat across from him, and folded her hands on the table in the way she had when she was prepared to hear something difficult. He told her everything. He started with Abilene, with Silas Croft and the stolen cattle and the federal testimony, and he went all the way through to the morning's events, to Voss on her front walk and the paper between his fingers. He told it plainly, and without the softening that might have made it easier to hear, but would have been a disrespect to her intelligence. Beatrice Keller was a woman who dealt in clear terms, and she deserved clear terms. She listened without speaking until he was finished. The coffee cooled between them, and the kitchen was quiet except for the sound of the wind outside and the distant muffled noise of the boarders in the dining room. "How long have you known that Voss was in the area?" she asked, which was not the first question he had expected. "I first noticed signs of someone watching about 2 weeks ago," he said. "Hoofprints behind the stable, a fire that had been used south of town. I could not be certain it was Croft's people until this morning." 2 weeks, she said. Her voice was neutral, which was different from calm. "Yes, and you said nothing. I was trying to be sure before I alarmed anyone unnecessarily." She looked at him for a long moment with an expression that he could not fully read, which was unusual because he had developed a fairly reliable understanding of her expressions over the past 6 months. Then she stood and went to the window that looked out over the backyard. "You are telling me," she said, without turning around, "that because of events from your past, someone has been watching this house, and watching me, and you knew it, and chose not to tell me." "Yes," he said, because there was no version of that which deserved a softer answer. "I understand why," she said, which surprised him. "That does not mean I am not angry about it. I know." She turned from the window. "Is there danger to the boarders?" "I do not believe Marcus Croft cares about anyone except me," Clark said. "Voss went to this house because it is where I live, and because Croft apparently thought it would be the most effective way to make a point." "What point?" "That he can reach what matters to me," Clark said, and the words were out before he had fully decided to say them, and they sat there between them with more weight than he had intended. Beatrice was very still for a moment. Then she said, "Are you saying that I matter to you, Clark?" He had been a man of few unnecessary words for most of his life. But Beatrice Keller was standing in her own kitchen in the late October afternoon light, having just absorbed a significant amount of difficult information with grace and directness, and she was asking him a plain question. He owed her a plain answer. "Yes," he said. "You do. You have for a while. I had not said it because I did not think the timing was right, and then the timing got forced." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Go and do what you need to do about this man, Clark. When it is resolved, come back and we will have the rest of this conversation." It was such a perfectly Beatrice Keller thing to say that something in his chest that had been clenched for a very long time loosened slightly. "All right," he said. "And Clark," she said as he stood, "yes. The next time you notice someone watching my house, you will tell me within the same day." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and meant it absolutely. Clark spent the next 3 days working with Sheriff Oates to understand the full scope of what they were dealing with. He sent a telegraph to the federal marshal's office in Fort Worth, which was the nearest office with jurisdiction over a man like Marcus Croft, and received back a reply that was concerning in a specific way. The marshal on the case had confirmed that Marcus Croft had been tracked to West Texas, that he had a warrant outstanding for parole violations, and that they had an active case building. What they did not have was Croft's current location. What Clark did have was Voss, who had not actually left Redstone. Clark had tracked him to a small camp in the creek bed 2 miles south of town, which was consistent with the kind of patient, watching presence that preceded something planned rather than something impulsive. He brought this to Oates, and they agreed on a strategy. Rather than driving Voss away again, which had clearly not worked, they would watch the watcher. Voss would eventually make contact with Croft or receive instructions, and that contact would lead them somewhere useful. In the meantime, Clark moved his room to the one at the front of the boarding house that had a view of the street, and he spoke quietly with the boarders about locking the doors at night, attributing it to a general rise in lawlessness in the territory, which was true enough to not be a lie. He also started bringing his breakfast earlier, at a time when only Beatrice was in the kitchen, because those early mornings had become something he was unwilling to reduce under any circumstances, danger or no. The morning after his conversation with her, Beatrice had set his coffee down and then sat across from him as she sometimes did in the early hour before the other boarders came down, and she said, "Tell me what you need to keep this house safe, and I will do it." "Stay inside after dark," he said. "Do not open the door to strangers without calling me or Oates first. If anything feels wrong, trust that feeling." She nodded. "What else?" "That is all, actually." She looked at him. "You are not going to tell me to be afraid. Would it do any good?" "None at all," she said. "Then no," he said. "I am not going to tell you to be afraid." Something shifted slightly in her expression, and she looked back down at her coffee, and Clark thought he might have seen the very beginning of a smile at the corner of her mouth. The following days had a strange doubled quality, the ordinary rhythms of the boarding house continuing on one surface, while underneath it ran the constant awareness of something gathering. Clark went about his duties as deputy, kept his watch, communicated with the federal marshal's office, and in the evenings he found himself drawn back to the boarding house not just out of vigilance, but out of a pull that was by now too strong to pretend it was anything other than what it was. Beatrice was not a woman who invited or encouraged sentimentality, but she was also not, Clark was learning, a woman who was indifferent to it. There was a conversation happening in the space between their direct conversations, made up of small things, the way she always knew without asking that he preferred his coffee with no sugar, the way he had started fixing small things around the house without being asked, and she had started leaving things that needed fixing where he would see them, the way they had begun occupying the same silences with a comfort that was different from the careful courtesy of landlady and boarder. One evening in the second week, it rained hard and fast the way Texas rain sometimes does in October, and the boarders who had been out scattered for shelter, and Clark found himself on the porch watching the lightning over the flat land to the west, and Beatrice came out and stood beside him. They did not speak for a long time, just watching the storm that was still several miles away and moving laterally rather than toward them, and the closeness was simple and warm and felt entirely natural. "My father loved storms," she said. "He used to say that the land was reminding you who it belonged to." "That is a good way to put it," Clark said. "He was a good man," she said. "He would have had opinions about you." Clark looked at her sideways. "Good ones or bad ones?" "Complicated ones," she said, and she was smiling genuinely. He had complicated opinions about most people worth having opinions about. Simple opinions were for simple people, he always said. "He sounds like he would have been interesting to talk to." "He was," she said, and there was the quiet underneath the words that grief makes, not sharp anymore, just present. "I miss him particularly in October. He loved October." Clark thought about what to say and decided against anything that would paper over the truth of what she had just shared. "I lost my mother when I was 12, he said. "She was the person who taught me to read. I sometimes miss her in bookshops." Beatrice looked at him with an expression that was open in a way he had not seen before, unguarded and warm. "Where did you grow up?" "Missouri," he said. "Small place called Harmon's Creek. Nothing there now." "Are there people you went back to?" "Not since I was 17, he said. "I had a reason to leave and then I kept leaving." "Do you ever want to stop?" she asked, and the question was direct in the specific way that Beatrice's direct questions were, carrying more than their literal surface. "Yes," he said. "I have been finding that I want that more than I expected." She looked out at the rain again. The lightning was moving east now, the worst of it passing, and the rain on the porch roof was a steady, clean sound. "Well," she said quietly, "Redstone could use people who stay." He turned to look at her, and she was already looking at him, and the rain and the porch and the October evening were all very specific and real, and Clark Calloway said the thing he had been building up to for 6 months. "I'm not going to pretend any longer that I am staying here for the job or for any practical reason," he said. "I stay here because of you, Beatrice, because of who you are and how you move through this world and how I feel when I am in the same room as you." I know that is a significant thing to say, and I am not saying it lightly. She was quiet for a moment that felt long but was probably not. Then she said, I know why you are saying it now and not earlier, and I understand it, but I need you to know that I have been aware of it for some time." "Have you?" he said. "I run a boarding house, Clark. I am very good at reading people." There was the dry humor appearing sideways as it always did. "I have been waiting for you to stop being careful and say it." "Were you going to wait much longer?" he asked. "Possibly another month," she said, and then she laughed, and he laughed with her. And the rain came lighter now, and the air smelled of wet mesquite and clean earth. And Clark reached over and took her hand where it rested on the porch railing, and she let him. And they stood like that for a while in the good October evening. Everything that was building between them continued to build, but the undercurrent of danger did not relax. Clark had been watching Voss's camp from a distance, using the high ground east of the creek bed, and on the fourth day he observed Voss receiving a rider. The rider was quick, spent less than 15 minutes at the camp and rode northwest. Clark could not follow without being seen, and the priority was still Voss, so he stayed. But the rider's direction told him something. Northwest of Redstone was the Calder Creek Road, which connected to the larger route through to Abilene. If Marcus Croft was moving, he was moving along a road Clark knew well. He sent another telegraph to the federal marshal's office, updating them on Voss's position and the rider's direction, and the reply came back within the day. The marshal, a man named Theodore Briggs, was already in motion with 2 deputies, having received intelligence from another source. He expected to reach the Calder Creek Road in 2 days and asked Clark to maintain his observation of Voss. 2 days. Clark could do 2 days. The complication arrived the next morning in the form of a letter slipped under the front door of the boarding house, which Beatrice found when she came downstairs at 5 in the morning, and brought immediately to Clark's room with a knock that woke him from a light, watchful sleep. He read it standing in his doorway, the lamp in Beatrice's hand throwing warm, unsteady light over the page. The letter was from Marcus Croft. It was brief and direct. It said that Clark could leave Redstone by midnight of the following day, or Marcus Croft would make sure that the people Clark had been foolish enough to care about would spend the rest of their lives understanding the cost of that association. It was, Clark recognized, exactly the kind of letter a desperate man wrote when his situation was closing in. Croft knew the marshals were looking for him. He was trying to create chaos before the net tightened, trying to use Clark's feelings as leverage to make Clark do something irrational. The trap was obvious. The question was what to do about it. He looked at Beatrice over the letter, and she had already read the expression on his face with the accuracy she had developed over the past several months. "What does it say?" she said. It was not quite a question. He handed her the letter and she read it without visible change in her expression, which told him more about her strength of character than anything he had previously observed, and he had observed quite a lot. "He wants you to run," she said. "He wants me to make a bad decision," Clark said. "Either running and giving him the satisfaction, or confronting him directly and walking into whatever he has set up. What is the third option?" He looked at her. "Hold position and trust the marshals." She handed the letter back. "Then that is what we do," she said, as if it were already settled, and went back to the kitchen to start the breakfast. He stayed in the doorway for a moment, watching her go, and felt something very particular that he had not felt in a long time. It was not just affection or desire or the simpler things that he had confused for real feeling in the past. It was something that felt like coming level, like finding a foundation that could hold weight, like 2 things that had been unbalanced finding their right position relative to each other. He got dressed and went down to help with the breakfast, which was not a thing he had done before, but Beatrice handed him the bread knife without comment and told him where the loaves were, and they worked in the kitchen together in the early morning dark with the lamp burning between them, and it was one of the quieter and more significant things Clark Calloway had ever done. He told Sheriff Oates about the letter. Oates read it, folded it carefully, and put it in his desk drawer. "Marcus Croft is rattled," Oates said. "Rattled men make mistakes." "I know," Clark said. I just need to make sure the mistakes he makes do not happen anywhere near that boarding house. What are you thinking? I am thinking that we should move the observation closer to Voss's camp tonight, Clark said. If Croft is going to move against the midnight deadline he invented, he will signal Voss first. If we are close enough, we will know before he moves. And if Marshal Briggs is already on the Calder Creek Road, then Croft is boxed, Clark said. He does not know about Briggs. He thinks his biggest problem is me. All right, Oates said. We go in tonight. That evening, Clark went to find Beatrice before he left for the observation. She was in the sitting room, reading by lamplight in the chair she favored, and she looked up when he came in with the particular awareness she had developed for his particular footsteps. He sat across from her and told her plainly what he and Oates were doing, because he had promised her he would not keep things from her again, and he kept his promises. She listened, set her book down, and said, "When will you be back?" "Before dawn," he said. "Oates is coming back at midnight. I will stay through until the morning shift." She looked at him with an expression that held worry and controlled it at the same time, and he felt the significance of being worried over, of having someone who would be awake wondering about him. "Be careful," she said, with a simplicity that meant something. "I will," he said. He stood to go and she stood too, and the sitting room was small and they were close, and Beatrice Keller reached up and put her hand against his jaw for just a moment, a brief and certain touch, and he covered her hand with his own for the same brief moment, and then he went to do what needed doing. The night was cold and clear, with a moon bright enough to make the creek bed visible from the ridge where Clark settled in to watch. He had told Oates to take the south approach and Clark would take the east, and they would close if something moved. At roughly 10 in the evening, something moved. Voss broke camp with efficiency, saddled his horse, and rode north, which was not the direction Clark had expected. North went back through town, which made no sense unless Voss was heading through to the far side, and the far side of Redstone going north was the boarding house sat on the north end of the main street. Clark moved. He came down from the ridge at a controlled run, cutting across the flat land at an angle that would bring him parallel to the road, and he pulled his horse from where it was tied at the creek crossing and rode hard, not in pursuit of Voss, but toward the boarding house. Because if Voss was going north through town, it was because Marcus Croft had given him a new instruction, and that instruction had come through the rider who had gone northwest, and whatever had changed in Croft's plan had pointed him at Beatrice. He reached the main street at a near gallop and pulled up in front of the boarding house to find the porch dark and quiet, no sign of Voss yet. He tied his horse, went to the door, and knocked with the specific knock he had established with Beatrice, 3 quick and 2 slow. He heard her footsteps on the stairs, quick and light, and then her voice through the door, steady. "Clark." "Yes," he said. "Open up." She did, and she was fully dressed, which told him she had not been asleep, had perhaps been waiting, and she had her father's old shotgun in her hands, which told him she was not remotely helpless, and he had never thought she was. "Voss rode north," he said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "I heard a horse on the main street about 10 minutes ago," she said. "I could not see who it was, so I came downstairs." "Where are the boarders?" "All in their rooms. I locked the back door an hour ago." He looked at her with the shotgun in her hands and the lamplight and the composed directness of her, and even in that urgent moment he felt the pull of her very specifically. "Stay inside," he said. "I need to find where Voss is going." "I heard him stop at the livery," she said. "The horse's hooves changed sound as he passed it. He may have gone inside." The livery stable was 3 buildings south of the boarding house on the same side of the street. If Voss was in the livery, it was not because he had a horse of his own there. It was because someone else had put a horse there for him, and that horse had a rider. Marcus Croft. Clark crossed the dark street at an angle, keeping to the shadows of the buildings, and came to the side wall of the livery from the north. He could hear voices inside, low and urgent, and he moved to the door that stood open by a crack and listened. One voice was Voss. The other was someone Clark had not heard in 4 years but recognized immediately, lower and rougher, and with the particular quality of a man who had been in a federal prison for several years and had come out of it harder and more focused in his anger. "Marcus Croft. You should have moved 2 days ago," Croft was saying. "I told you to move when I sent Riley. There was a federal lawman on the Calder Creek Road," Voss said. "I did not want to move until I knew what that meant." A silence. Clark held very still. "How many?" Croft said. "3 riders, Briggs from the Fort Worth office." Croft made a sound that was not quite a word. "They moved faster than I thought." "We should go," Voss said. "There is nothing here worth." "There is everything here," Croft said, and the cold focus in his voice was the voice of a hidden motive made explicit, the voice of a forced choice being imposed on someone else. "Clark Calloway cost me 4 years of my life and cost my brother the same. I am not leaving Texas without making sure he understands what that costs." Clark opened the livery door and stepped inside. Both men turned. Voss went for his gun and Clark shot it out of his hand before it cleared the holster, which was not the most elegant shot he had ever made, but it was faster than the alternative, and Voss made a sharp pained sound and the gun hit the straw-covered floor. Croft did not go for his gun, which was either wisdom or the calculation of a man who had something else in mind. He was a wide, square-built man, younger than Clark expected, no more than 35, with the institutional pallor of someone recently off a long prison sentence and the flat, determined eyes of someone who had spent those years planning. "Calloway," he said. "Croft," Clark said. He kept his gun leveled and calm. "Put your hands where I can see them and this ends cleanly." "Nothing about this ends cleanly," Croft said. "You know that." "What I know is that Marshal Briggs is on the Calder Creek Road with 2 deputies, and my sheriff is somewhere south of this building right now," Clark said. "What I know is that you are out of options in every direction. So you can make this simple, or you can make it complicated, but it ends tonight either way." Croft looked at him for a long moment, and Clark watched the calculation happen behind those flat eyes, watched the man run through the options he had left and find them insufficient, and watched the decision come. Croft put his hands up. Oates came through the back door of the livery 30 seconds later, having apparently made the same deduction Clark had about the livery being the likely meeting point. He took charge of both men with the methodical capability of a man who had been doing this work for 20 years, and Clark stepped back and let him, because Oates was still the sheriff, and Clark was still the deputy, and the proper order of things mattered. It took another hour and a half for Marshal Briggs to arrive from the Calder Creek Road, having apparently been closer than expected when the telegraph from Oates reached him. He was a compact, methodical man with a neat gray beard, and he took custody of Marcus Croft and Voss with professional efficiency and departed with them before midnight, which meant that Clark's self-imposed deadline had been technically met, though in rather the opposite way than Croft had intended. Clark stood in the street watching the marshal's party move south, and he was aware of a weariness that was deep and total, the kind that comes when something that has been held tense for a very long time is finally allowed to relax. He was also aware that this specific chapter of his dark past, the one that had followed him from Abilene across 4 years and several hundred miles, was now fully closed. There would be a trial, and Clark would likely need to testify again, but the threat, the active danger that had been sitting outside Beatrice's house like a patient weight, was gone. He turned and walked back to the boarding house. The lamp was still on in the sitting room window. He knocked his knock and she opened the door before he had finished the pattern, which meant she had been standing close to it, waiting. She looked at him for a moment, reading his expression, and some of the tension he saw in the line of her shoulders eased. "It is over," she said. "Croft and Voss are both in federal custody," he said. "Marshal Briggs has them." She exhaled a single clean breath and stepped back to let him in. He came in and she set her father's shotgun against the wall and turned to face him, and the sitting room was warm and small, and the lamp was burning well, and outside Redstone was quiet in the late Texas night. "Thank you," she said, which was a simple thing to say after everything, but she said it with a weight that carried all the layers underneath it. "I am sorry you were in any danger because of me," he said. "You are going to have to stop apologizing for things that were not your choices," she said, with the dry, precise quality she had for this kind of observation. "You testified against dangerous men because it was the right thing to do. That they decided to be angry about it is not your fault." "You are remarkably reasonable about this," he said. "I am remarkably reasonable about most things," she said. "It is one of my better qualities." He looked at her, and the firelight was warm, and the danger was gone, and he was standing in the sitting room of a woman he had been falling in love with for 6 months. "Beatrice," he said, "I believe I told you earlier this fall that when this was resolved, you and I were going to have the rest of a conversation." She looked at him with clear eyes and said, "I believe I told you the same thing." "Then let me have it now," he said. "I love you. I have been in love with you for longer than I have been willing to admit, and I am asking you plainly and seriously whether you would consider building something with me. Not just the current arrangement, something real and permanent. I want to marry you, if you will have me, and I want to stay in Redstone for the rest of my life, and I want to do all of that with you." Beatrice Keller was quiet for a moment that was not long enough to be worrying, just long enough to be certain. "I have been waiting for you to stop being careful about that too," she said, and there was the smile, real and full, one of the full middle of her smiles, and she crossed the 3 feet between them, and he caught her hands in his, and then they were close enough that the conversation moved into the territory that did not require words. He kissed her in the sitting room of her boarding house in Redstone, Texas, on a cold October night in 1879, and she kissed him back with the wholehearted directness she brought to everything she did. And outside the lamp burned steady, and the street was quiet, and the air smelled of cold, clean autumn. The following spring was a season of change in Redstone that felt earned rather than accidental. Marcus Croft was tried in federal court in Fort Worth in February of 1880 and received 12 years, with his parole violation stacking on top of the new charges. Voss testified against him in exchange for a reduced sentence of 5 years, which Clark thought was lenient, but was not his decision to make. The important thing was that the chapter was closed and double-locked. Clark testified in Fort Worth in January, traveling there and back in a week, and Beatrice had sent him with a letter that he read on the stage going and kept in his coat pocket for the duration. It was a practical letter mostly, reminding him to eat a hot meal before the testimony and to get adequate sleep the night before. But it was also a letter from a woman who loved him, and the warmth of that fact was very portable and very useful. He came back to Redstone, and she was on the porch in the January cold when the stage came in, because she had calculated the schedule accurately, and she came down the steps to meet him and took his arm, and that was the homecoming Clark Calloway had not known he needed for 4 years. They were married in March, at the small Baptist church on the east side of Redstone, in a ceremony that was attended by essentially the whole town, because Beatrice had been a Redstone institution for long enough that her wedding was everyone's event. Sheriff Oates stood up with Clark, looking extremely dignified in his good coat. Mrs. Dunbar from the dry goods store cried in a front pew. The Hernandez family, the 5 children and their parents, took up most of a pew on the east side and were collectively the most enthusiastic audience in the building. Beatrice wore a dress that she had made herself over the winter months, a deep blue that suited her in a way Clark had tried twice and failed to articulate, and had finally just told her directly was extremely beautiful, which she had received with the same dignified composure with which she received most compliments, and then privately looked very pleased about, and he knew the second response was the real one. She walked down the aisle of that church with a quiet certainty and a real smile, and Clark Calloway stood at the front of it and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that his life had arrived somewhere worth arriving at. The minister spoke, and they said their vows, and Clark said his with the plainness and weight that he brought to things he meant, and Beatrice said hers with a directness that made several people in the pews feel that they were witnessing something genuinely serious and real. which they were. They were married, and Redstone cheered them on the steps of the church, and someone had obtained a supply of confetti from somewhere, and the April wind took it in every direction at once. The boarding house continued operating, because it was Beatrice's life's work and a practical necessity, and Clark had never had any intention of asking her to abandon it. What changed was that Clark moved from being a boarder paying $2 a week to being a man with his name on the deed, and the bedroom situation was resolved in the natural way of newly married people. Clark expanded his role in the boarding house gradually, and in ways that were genuinely useful rather than performative. He had good carpentry skills from a summer he had spent working a construction crew in his early 20s, and the boarding house had accumulated a number of repairs that Beatrice had been managing around rather than solving. He fixed the porch railing that had been soft on the left side. He replaced 2 window frames that had warped and let in cold air. He built a second bookshelf in the sitting room because the 3 Beatrice had were insufficient for her current reading situation. Beatrice observed these additions with the expression she had for things that were good but that she did not want to make a fuss over, which was different from her expression for things she was indifferent to. And Clark had by now a sufficiently refined catalog of her expressions to know the difference. He also continued his work as deputy sheriff, which suited him well. Redstone was not a violent town for the most part. The cattle trade brought activity but not the worst kind of lawlessness, and Clark's particular combination of skills and presence was enough to keep things manageable. Sheriff Oates was talking about retirement, and Clark was thinking seriously about what came after that, because he was a man who had found his place and was not inclined to be careless with it. The summer of 1880 was hot and long and very good. Clark came home to the boarding house in the evenings to Beatrice, to the smell of whatever she had cooked, and the particular quality of the light through the sitting room windows in the late afternoon, and the books on the shelves, and the sound of her moving through rooms she had always occupied. These were specific and daily pleasures that he found he did not become accustomed to in the way that things you take for granted become invisible. He remained thoroughly attentive to all of them. They talked in the evenings, which was one of the ongoing revelations of being married to Beatrice Keller. She was not a woman who talked for the sake of filling silence, but she had a great deal to say about things that interested her, and the things that interested her were wide and various, and those conversations took Clark into territory he had not previously visited and found he liked very much. He talked to her about things he had not talked about with anyone, the years after he left Missouri and the places he had passed through, and what he had seen and understood and gotten wrong about the world. He told her about his mother, the full version, not just the shorthand of a bookshop. She listened with the deep attention she brought to things she considered worth listening to, and she asked questions that showed she had heard the actual content rather than just the surface of it. "You have been very alone for a long time," she said one evening, not as an accusation but as a statement of something she had been thinking through. "I have," he said. "How does it feel not being alone now?" He thought about how to answer that honestly. "Like something I did not know I was cold without," he said, "and now that I am warm I understand how cold it was." She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Yes, that is exactly right." In August, Beatrice told him she was expecting their first child. She told him over breakfast directly, without ceremony, which was characteristic, and then she set his plate in front of him and sat across the table in her usual place and waited to see what he did. What Clark did was set his coffee down and look at her for a moment with an expression that he could not control very well and did not try to, and then he reached across the table and took her hand and said, "I am very happy about this. Are you?" "I am," she said, and the simplicity of her smile in that moment was one of the things he would return to for the rest of his life when he needed to remember what happiness actually looked like. The pregnancy was, in Beatrice's characteristically competent style, managed efficiently. She continued running the boarding house through the winter with adjustments as needed, accepted help from Clark and from Mrs. Hernandez, who came in 3 mornings a week to assist with the heavier work, and who Beatrice paid a fair wage for, and generally approached the entire enterprise with the same practical dignity she brought to everything. Clark's anxiety about the process was more visible than he would have liked, and Beatrice handled it with patience and the occasional gentle observation that he was going to need to calm down because she was perfectly fine. He took these observations to heart and worked on calming down, with moderate success. Their son was born in March of 1881, in the same month as their first anniversary, which Beatrice said was convenient for bookkeeping purposes, and Clark said was suspicious in the best possible way. They named him Thomas, for Beatrice's father, which had been Beatrice's suggestion and Clark's immediate and sincere agreement. Thomas Calloway came into the world with a substantial opinion about it, expressed loudly, and Clark held him in the small hours of the morning, while Beatrice slept from exhaustion, and looked at this person who was completely new and simultaneously already the most important person in the room after his mother, and felt something wordless and enormous that was apparently what it felt like to be a father. Redstone celebrated the birth with the communal enthusiasm of a small town that had adopted Clark Calloway by extension of its deep regard for Beatrice, and Sheriff Oates presented the boy with a tiny deputy's badge made of polished tin that Clark suspected Oates had commissioned especially for the occasion, though he denied it with a dignity that was not fully convincing. The boarding house settled into its new shape, and the new shape was full and varied and good. Thomas grew with the speed that children seem to manage, going from a small and emphatic infant to a small and emphatic toddler in what felt like a very compressed amount of time, and the boarding house accommodated him with the flexible resilience of a well-built structure. Clark and Beatrice moved through their days with the complementary competence of 2 people who had both been independently capable before they found each other, and who were now finding that combined capability was both more effective and more enjoyable than the solitary version. He fixed things and kept the town orderly, and brought home the particular quality of attention that told Beatrice she was seen and valued. She ran the house with elegance and efficiency, raised Thomas with warmth and structure, loved Clark with the full-hearted directness that was her particular quality, and continued reading her books. Sheriff Oates retired in the autumn of 1881, and Clark Calloway was elected sheriff of Redstone County by a margin that was slightly flattering and not entirely surprising, since he had been doing the work anyway for the better part of 2 years. He took the office with a sense of purpose that felt different from any work he had done before, because this time the purpose was rooted in the specific place and the specific people he had committed to. He pinned the sheriff's badge on in the morning before breakfast, and Beatrice straightened it for him at the breakfast table with the focused precision she brought to small adjustments, and Thomas, who was sitting in his chair eating with the aggressive enthusiasm of a child who had recently discovered he had strong opinions about food, looked up at the badge and reached for it. "That one is not for you yet," Clark told him. Thomas had opinions about this that he expressed briefly, and then abandoned in favor of the more pressing matter of his breakfast, and Clark and Beatrice exchanged a look over his head that was one of the small private communications of married people, and contained several things that did not need words. By the summer of 1882, Redstone had grown enough that there was a second dry goods store and a proper doctor's office, and the boarding house had added 2 rooms in the back addition that Clark built over the spring with help from a carpenter named Ed Torres, who had come to town with the railroad survey crew and stayed. The Hernandez children were in school, which had been a genuine point of pride for Clark and for Beatrice, who had helped Mrs. Hernandez write the letter of enrollment that the school board had been reluctant about, until Clark had a direct conversation with the board's chairman about the laws of the territory, which had resolved the matter. These were the injustices of the age. the casual exclusions and the built-in assumptions about who belonged where and who deserved what. And Clark had found that being a sheriff with a specific commitment to the people in his town meant acknowledging those injustices and pushing back on them with the tools he had, which were his badge and his standing and his willingness to be direct about what was right. Beatrice thought this was correct and said so, and also noted that Thomas was going to need to understand it from the time he was old enough to understand anything, which Clark agreed with completely. In the late fall of 1882, Beatrice told him at breakfast again, with the same direct manner as before, that they were expecting a second child. Clark did not set his coffee down this time, having learned from the first experience to maintain composure, though the composure was not entirely convincing, and Beatrice looked at him with the specific warmth that told him she did not mind. "Are you hoping for something particular?" he asked. "A healthy child," she said. "That is all I hope for." "That is very sensible," he said. "I told you I was reasonable," she said. Their second child was a girl, born in the spring of 1883, and they named her Margaret after Clark's mother, which had been Clark's suggestion and Beatrice's immediate and sincere agreement. Margaret Calloway arrived considerably less dramatically than Thomas had, which the midwife said was normal for second children, and she had her mother's dark hair and her father's green eyes. And Thomas, who was 2 years old and had been prepared for the new arrival as well as a 2-year-old can be prepared for anything, regarded her with the mix of suspicion and tentative fascination that older siblings manage. He came around on her within approximately a week, and after that he was fiercely protective in the way of small children with smaller siblings, which was a quality that Clark watched with recognition and no small amount of feeling. The summer that Margaret was an infant and Thomas was approaching 3 was one of the golden ones, the ones you look back on and understand with hindsight that you were in them at their best. Redstone was prospering in the careful way of towns that have found a sustainable shape. The boarding house was full more often than not, and Beatrice had established a reputation that brought decent travelers out of their way to stay there rather than in the rougher establishments of the larger towns nearby. Clark's work as sheriff was absorbing and purposeful, and contained enough variety to remain interesting. In the evenings, when the children were settled and the house was quiet, Clark and Beatrice sat in the sitting room with the additional bookshelf he had built and the lamp burning well, and they read or talked or simply occupied the same space in the easy way of people who have been long enough in love to be comfortable in it without being less alive to it. He had not become accustomed to her in the way that flattens things. She was too interesting to become a background, too particular to fade into familiarity without remainder. She continued to read things and have opinions about them, and the opinions were always worth hearing. She continued to manage the boarding house with a competence that he observed and appreciated with the fresh eye of someone who understood how much skill went into making things look effortless. She continued to be kind to the people in Redstone who needed kindness, and firm with the people who needed firmness, and funny in her dry sideways way at exactly the moments that needed it. He told her he loved her regularly and specifically, because she had spent a long time alone, and he was of the opinion that being loved should be clearly audible rather than only implied, and she received it with the particular quality she had for things that moved her, a kind of stillness and warmth that he knew by now was the real response underneath the composed exterior. She told him she loved him in the ways that were characteristic to her, which included saying it directly when it came up naturally, and also included making sure his coffee was right, and leaving the book she had finished on his desk when she thought he might enjoy it, and straightening his badge, and standing on the porch in the cold January air when the stage came in. The years passed with the texture of a life being genuinely lived. Thomas Calloway, at 5, was an extremely opinionated child with a powerful memory and a developing sense of justice that Clark found simultaneously exhausting and encouraging. He had figured out that his father was the law in Redstone, and had begun accompanying this understanding with a commentary on the fairness of various situations that was occasionally more accurate than comfortable. Beatrice handled his questions about fairness with a directness that Clark admired because it neither simplified nor condescended, and Thomas absorbed the answers with the seriousness of a small person building a set of principles. Margaret, at 3, was quieter than her brother and more observant, watching everything with her green eyes and accumulating understanding at a pace that periodically surprised people who had underestimated her on account of her being small and quiet. She was intensely attached to her mother and to Clark in different ways, following Beatrice through the kitchen with focused attention, and sitting on Clark's knee in the evenings to look at the illustrations in the natural history books he had ordered from a catalog. In the spring of 1885, Beatrice sat across the breakfast table from Clark one more time and told him there was going to be a third child, and Clark smiled and took her hand and felt the same enormousness he had felt the first time, which had not diminished with familiarity. "You are not going to tell me to be calm this time, are you?" he said. "I never told you to be calm," she said. "I told you that I was fine, which I am." "You are," he said. "You are very fine." She raised an eyebrow at the warmth in his voice, in the way she did when she was pleased but was not going to say so directly, and poured more coffee. Their third child, another boy, was born that fall, and they named him James, for no particular family reason but because it suited him, and James Calloway was from his first weeks a child of enormous good humor, who seemed to find the world generally acceptable, which was a personality that both his parents found restful after the vivid intensity of his older siblings. Clark Calloway stood in the backyard of the Keller boarding house on a September evening in 1885 with his third child in his arms, and looked at the sky over the flat Texas land, and thought about a morning 6 years earlier when he had stepped off a stage with no intention of staying, and the door had opened, and Beatrice Keller had looked at him with her frank and assessing gaze, and told him the clear terms. He thought about the particular and winding path from that morning to this evening, through danger and revelation, and the long, careful approach of two self-sufficient people toward the vulnerable and excellent thing of loving each other. And he thought about Marcus Croft in his federal prison and Voss in his. And he thought about the stranger on the porch steps with the folded paper, the man who had wanted to reach Beatrice and had found Clark Calloway in the way. And the particular force with which Clark had said those words, "She does not know your name, and she is not going to." He had meant it in that moment as protection, the most direct and absolute barrier he could place between Beatrice and the threat. But looking back on it now with the distance of years, he understood that it had also been something else. It had been the moment when the thing he felt had become visible in his actions, when the careful neutral distance he had been maintaining had finally collapsed under the weight of what was actually true. He had loved her then. He had been in the act of demonstrating it before he had even said it. The back door opened, and Beatrice came out into the September evening with a shawl around her shoulders and the composed warmth of a woman fully comfortable in her own life. She stood beside him and looked at James, who was awake and regarding the sky with the mild approval that characterized him. "Thomas is attempting to convince Margaret that the west bedroom is his by right of seniority," she said. "I have referred the dispute to your jurisdiction." "That is a wise use of available resources," Clark said. She leaned against him slightly, and he adjusted James to one arm and put the other around her, and they stood in the September evening in the yard of the house she had inherited and made into something, in the town where he had arrived as a stranger and decided to become a citizen, in the life they had made together out of the improbable combination of a passing gunslinger and a boarding-house proprietor who gave clear terms and meant them. Inside, Thomas and Margaret were negotiating with the volume characteristic of Calloway children, and James had apparently decided the sky was satisfactory and was going to sleep against his father's shoulder, and the mesquite tree in the corner of the yard was doing better than it had been doing 6 years ago, having apparently decided that survival was worthwhile. Beatrice turned her head and looked up at Clark, and he looked back at her. And there was no particular need for a dramatic declaration, because the declarations had been made and the vows had been kept and the love was right there, present and specific and daily and enormous, the way real things are. Happy. He said quietly, the way you say a question when you already know the answer but want to hear it. Yes, she said. You. Completely, he said. Redstone settled into the evening around them, the lights coming on in the windows of the houses along the main street, the last of the day's business concluding, the cattle calls and the storefronts, and the courthouse where Clark's name was on the door, and the church where they had been married, and the school where Thomas would start in 2 weeks, looking forward to it, with the excitement of a child who had inherited his mother's love of learning. And all of it was theirs in the way that a place is yours when you have given your best years and your real self to it, and it has given back something solid and lasting in return. Clark Calloway had come to Redstone as a man passing through. He was a man who had stayed, and on the porch of the boarding house that was also their home, with the lamp burning in the sitting room window and the children's voices inside, and the woman he loved leaning against him in the September air. The staying was the best and most deliberate thing he had ever done in his life. The choice that had turned out to be not a limitation but an expansion, not an ending of possibility, but the beginning of everything worth having. The land stretched out flat and wide around Redstone in the last light, and the sky above West Texas went from blue to gold to the dark that comes before the stars. And in the boarding house, the lamp burned steady, and Clark and Beatrice Calloway went inside to their family and their life, and the long and excellent continuation of everything they had built together. Beginning from the moment a bold gunslinger had stood on a dusty street and told a stranger plainly that the woman inside those doors did not know his name and was not going to. She had known Clark's name. She had learned it on the morning he arrived, and she had been saying it ever since, in the particular way she said it that made it sound like a word that belonged exactly where she put it, in the vocabulary of her daily life, in the voice of the woman who was his and who he was, permanently and completely, and with no intention of ever being anything else.